It's your friend Will here, and I'd like to walk you through, very briefly, how to set up and begin a game of 15XX, the narrative skirmish rules inspired by the pike and shot Renaissance era that I'm currently developing and playtesting. Now, as we have called out in previous videos, your party, or your warband, in 15XX is composed of 4 different groups. And here we see the 2 example parties we'll be using for the purposes of our video today. On the left, we have a warband made up of a strong point, that is a specific piece of terrain with specific rules and benefits attached to it. And then a group of dogs, in this case representing hunting hounds, a group of birds, which are falcons, and then a group of shot. In this case, the story we're telling about this group is these would probably be noblemen out on a hunt. And to compare and contrast that against their counterpoints, we have another party, also of 4 groups. You'll see that groups can be a single base, it can be 2 bases, it can be 3 bases. And all except for the strong points are all based to the same size, or at least preferably. Here we have, starting at the top, a group of 2 bases of transport. In particular, these are wagons and carts. Then we have a 2-base group of foot with pikes. And then we have 2 different types of cavalry. These are 2 groups. Cavalry are both single base groups. The fine-looking fellows in the red coats, as you can probably pick up on, are going to be our lance-armed gendarmes or impact horse. And then here we have a single base group of shooting cavalry, shooting horse, our pistol-armed riders. So to begin your game of 15XX, you'll need, obviously, a party, or 2 if you're going to be hosting the game. You also need a set of what we call initiative tokens. And then the game does use various markers. For the purposes of setup and the initial phases of the game, you'll need 1 marker. The game 15XX is played on a small size table. We want to be able to have a game where we can fit it in and easily into spaces like your kitchen tables or coffee tables. Here we have a 2x3 table designed for these 15mm scale figures. 15XX is played in a series of 5 phases. Well, 6 if you consider the setup phase. And setup is really simple in 15XX. This is a casual narrative game. It's not designed for strict, highly competitive settings. So setup really entails deciding who would be the attacker, who would be the defender. That question has the following ramifications. Defenders get to place the terrain, and attackers get to set the zones of deployment. Beyond that, the question of attacker and defender becomes relevant if you are doing campaign play rather than just a quick pickup game, because campaign play will have secondary objectives and scenarios that are contingent on your party being able to be the attacker or defender. And in those cases, our recommendation is just, hey, be friends, be casual, show good gamesmanship, and decide amongst you who would be the attacker or defender. Once the setup phase is complete, the game moves into the real phases of gameplay in order that begins with a fog of war phase, and then proceeds to what we call the contact phase. And then once the fog of war and contact have been completed, the game moves into its core, what we call the core gameplay loop, and that's a series of repeating 3 phases, from an initiative phase to a movement phase to the action phase. And then once the action phase is resolved, the game then loops back again to the initiative phase and continues through that loop until there's a victor. So the fog of war phase, let's say that we've gone through setup, we have this table here complete with only about 80% of the piece's terrain actually completely painted, as I think like a lot of us who are tabletop gamers, always working on new bits of terrain, and that's what I'm using here. We'll say for the purposes of this example that the zones of deployment, we have decided on the 4 zones on the far sides of the table. So what we will do, if the attackers have set the zone of deployments for a cavalry heavily party on the right, we will go ahead and place their initiative tokens in the zones of deployment. You can place your tokens wherever you would prefer. For our purposes, we will just line up our 4 tokens left to right like this. And then likewise, your defender would do the same with their set of initiative tokens. You can set up in any zone. So for example, we have 1 up here on the ledge, 2, you can double stack in zones. And here we have an interesting case of one of the zones being pretty full with terrain. So you can start out in terrain if you would like. Now here we have our initial deployments, but the game does not stop there. What I've liked from other rules, particularly a set from the Two Fat Lardies in the UK, is this idea of beginning your game in media res, or the opposite of some of the larger battle games we see where 2 sides line up on the far side of the table, and then you spend several turns maneuvering and advancing forward until you finally come into contact. I like the idea of your 2 parties meeting by chance and circumstance as much as it is a planned scrap, as it were. So what we do is once you have your tokens placed, the fog of war phase continues. The attacker gets to maneuver their tokens, 1 group, 1 token at a time, 2 points of movement or 2 zones following all the normal rules for movement. You can move to any adjacent zone, not just forward, backward, left, or right, but all adjacent zones, and start with a single token at a time. So what we'll do is go 1, because you can cut corners adjacently, and 2. And then from there, your defender would be able to take their first moves. So likewise, we'll do 1 and 2. As you can see, you can move to any space within the zone. You may want to take advantage of terrain and cover opportunities, but for this initial purpose, the 2 parties are maneuvering throughout the place where the conflict, where the encounter will happen, not knowing that the other group is there. And so the fog of war phase continues until you get a group that comes within 2 zones of another group or another token. So let's just quickly run through what that might look like. 1 and 2. And then we're going to move our token here in terrain. Because there's enough opening here, as you might be able to tell through the trees, this doesn't count as completely blocked off or terrain that's going to cost you additional movement. But let's say we wanted to move our token up onto this ridge. So 1 will move through that terrain as 1 point. However, moving up elevation, unless there is a clear, easy path, such as we see in this road up the hill, requires a point of movement. I've already moved 1 to go to this zone. To get to the second zone that is up on that ridge would require 2 points of movement. I can't make it, so I will leave that token there. The attacker then, again, gets to move 1 and 2 around here, and then we will just quickly move through the remainder of our movement opportunities. We'll set our 2 tokens here in this ravine, and then 1, 2. We've now had a token or a group come within point blank range. Point blank range is 2 zones. Has come within point blank range, and so now they have been spotted. The 2 groups, or in this case 3 groups, all see and recognize one another and understand that this encounter will be starting soon. So what we'll do for the very first group that comes into that point blank range and is in line of sight, because I think you can make the argument here that the white token up on the ridge on the other side of the bridge might not be able to see the attacking token. So we will consider them not locked in right now. But the group facing each other on or in this gully definitely are. So we'll place that marker next to the token that first got locked in. Now these three groups cannot move any further. However, all others which are not within that point blank range can. So we'll continue moving those that can. Starting here with our friend down here, 1 point of movement to get up that ridge, and then the second point to actually move into that. So we'll leave that token there. And then we'll go ahead and move 1 and 2. Now, again, this is an example of some of the casual nature of gameplay. We can make an argument of, can you see the groups in the gully? And I'll say you can't. So I'll say this figure here is not locked in yet. However, he's also within 2 of our figure behind the trees. But again, because he's coming up that pathway, I don't think they can see one another. So we'll say that they're not locked in yet. That means we're moving over here to our token up on this far ridge by the hill. And we will move them 1 and 2 out to the far end. That brings us back to the attacker. For the purposes of expediency, as I shake my camera around, we'll move up here. Boom. That brings them within point blank range, 2 zones. They're now locked in over here on the right. I'm going to pass. You can choose to pass with your turns. Once you have a token locked in, you can choose to pass. I will choose to pass and keep my defender's white token back there. My attacker token will move up the ramp all the way. However, that does bring them within line of sight of the other token. So that means they're locked in. So the only token we have available to move at this point is the attacker's, who's back here. And I'm actually going to pass and leave them in place. Once you've had both players get all of their tokens locked in, or have locked in one token and have passed on the remainder, the Fog of War phase ends. So now all both parties have moved. They've found each other in the midst of what is a bit of a wilderness terrain here in the woods and hills, or whatever your table represents. That concludes the Fog of War phase, and then leads us into the contact phase, which follows. So the contact phase moves much more quickly, and it begins by looking at the group or the token that first got locked in, the one that you marked with the marker. So remove that marker right now. And the contact phase begins with whatever group has that marker. In this case, it was the attackers. And again, alternating activation, alternating reveals of your party's groups. And this is where there gets to be a fair amount of strategy involved of what groups, what troops you reveal where and when. However, you always start with the one that got locked in first. So what we'll do is place our shooting horse here. Again, you can place them anywhere in the zone, but because there's no terrain or cover, particularly here, it doesn't matter all that much. And then from there, it flips back over to the other player, in this case, the defender. So we'll go ahead and place a group in that gully, even though because the defender wasn't the first party to be locked in, I could choose any token I wish, but for the purposes of this, we'll go ahead and place our dogs, even though that remained pretty out of focus when I brought it up to the camera. Now, the thing with multi-base groups is that you can place your groups. The first base has to be within the zone that the token was in. The other bases can be in any adjacent zone. So I'm going to be very gamey and place one of my other dog bases up here on this ridge. And then I will back up my dogs in the valley or in this gully and place the third base down there with them, because you can have up to 3 bases total. So yours and your opponent's in a single zone. And from there, then it just proceeds both sides one at a time, revealing where their groups are located. So I'll go up here to the ridge, and I will place my gendarmes here to threaten from above. And then back here in our behind the wood on the ridge, we'll go ahead and place our, oh boy, let's go ahead and place our shot actually. So here, and here. It's probably a better strategy there, but for the purposes of our video, I won't take too much time to watch me dilly-dally about. We'll move back over to our attackers, and you know what? We'll go ahead and place our wagons back here. Coming up behind the cavalry as they're moving through. And then we'll place our falcons along with the hunting hounds down here. Go ahead and place the all bird base because birds in this case have slightly different rules. The bases are going to be composed a little bit differently. One base would have a bird keeper, as it were. The other one would just be the birds themselves. So again, because I can place the base in any adjacent zone, once I have placed one base in the zone where the token was, I'm going to place the bird keeper up on the ridge. And moving back to the attackers who have their token on the far side here, and I'll go ahead and place my pikemen. And I'm going to go ahead and place them one here. And this is a little bit gamey because I know what is going up in the defender space, so I will go ahead and place the other base a little bit advanced in another adjacent zone, and that leaves the last token of the defender, which is their strong point, the altar that the noble huntsmen have decided to go give some religious devotion to as part of their frolicking through the woods. And so there you have the initial setup of the encounter as it leads into the initiative phase, that core gameplay loop. The encounter begins really in earnest. And what's interesting, I think, about how the fog of war and contact phases work is that it means you don't have two static deployment zones where your troops line up on one edge of the board, my troops line up on another edge, and then we go from there. It really gives you that in media res kind of dynamic deployment where if you want to be sneaky or smart about it, there's a lot of thought in how you arrange your tokens and go about moving into contact with your enemy for the initial contact phase or the initial fog of war phase. And I think that provides a really interesting aspect to the gameplay and the encounters that follow. So from here, as I said, the game would then move into that initiative phase. So take a look at the round breakdown video if you have questions about how that works. If you have additional questions, feel free to email me or post them in the playtest group. Thanks a bunch.